Imagine standing with only 300 warriors before the largest army the world has ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers are marching toward you. Behind them stands a king who considers himself divine and is determined to conquer all of Greece. Most people would flee, but not the Spartans. At a narrow pass called Thermopylae, King Leonidas and his men decided to stay and fight, even though they knew they probably wouldn't survive this battle. Why did these men sacrifice themselves voluntarily? How could a few thousand Greeks hold off a massive army for several days? And why did this battle become one of the most legendary stories of courage and sacrifice in the entire history of mankind? This is the story of the 300 Spartans. Part 1. The Last Battle of the 300 Spartans. In 480 BC, Greece faced one of the greatest threats in its entire history. From the east, an army advanced, larger than anything the world at that time had ever seen. It was led by King Xerxes I, the powerful ruler of the Persian Empire, a man who considered himself destined by the gods. His goal was clear and uncompromising. Greece was to fall, its cities were to be subjugated, and resistance against Persian power was to be broken forever. But in the path of this massive force lay a narrow mountain pass, a place that would later become immortal in history. Its name was Thermopylae, which means the Hot Gates. Here, between steep mountains and the sea, a small group of Greek warriors stood against the largest army of their time. They were led by a king from Sparta, Leonidas, and among his men were 300 of the most disciplined and fearless warriors of the ancient world. Their numbers were small, their chances seemingly hopeless. Nevertheless, they decided to stay and fight. Why did these men stand against an overwhelming force that far outnumbered them? What really happened in that narrow pass of Thermopylae? And how could a battle that was a military defeat become one of the most famous stories of courage and sacrifice in all of human history? To understand these questions, we must turn back the clock a few years. For the story of the Battle of Thermopylae did not begin in 480 BC, but a decade earlier on a plain called Marathon. Part 2. The First Persian Invasion and the Battle of Marathon. To understand why the Persians marched on Greece in the first place, we must go back about 10 years before the events of Thermopylae to the year 490 BC. That was when the Persian Empire's first major attempt to subjugate Greece began. The order for this came from King Darius the Great, the powerful ruler of an empire that stretched from Mesopotamia across Egypt to far into Central Asia. His empire was vast, wealthy, and seemingly unstoppable. But in the eyes of Darius, the Greeks were guilty of a grave insult. Several Greek cities had previously supported a revolt against Persian rule in Asia Minor. For Darius, this was a direct attack on his authority. Greece had to be punished, so in 490 BC, a Persian army landed on the coast of Attica, on a wide plain called Marathon, just a few kilometers from Athens. The Persians were numerically superior and expected a quick victory. But what happened next surprised the entire ancient world. A significantly smaller army of Greek hoplites, led mainly by Athens, stood against the Persians. These soldiers were heavily armed, excellently organized, and fought with a discipline that their opponents underestimated. As the battle began, the Greeks charged forward and struck the Persian ranks with full force. Despite their smaller numbers, they managed to completely shatter the Persian army. The Persian soldiers were driven back, many fell on the battlefield, others fled in panic to their ships. The defeat at Marathon was a massive humiliation for the Persian Empire. A small alliance of Greek city-states had beaten one of the most powerful armies in the world. For King Darius, this defeat was unbearable. He swore revenge and immediately began preparations for a new, even larger invasion of Greece. But before he could realize this plan, he died. His dream of retribution, however, did not disappear with him. It passed to his son and successor, a man with even greater ambitions, Xerxes I. Part 3. Xerxes prepares the largest army in the world. When Xerxes I ascended the throne of the Persian Empire, he inherited not only one of the largest empires of the time, but also his father's unfulfilled desire for revenge. The defeat at Marathon had shaken the empire's prestige, and Xerxes was firmly determined to wipe out this shame. But for Xerxes, it wasn't just about avenging his father's defeat. In his eyes, Greece was a defiant territory that finally had to be integrated into the vast Persian Empire. He considered himself a ruler appointed by divine power, destined to succeed where his father had failed. To achieve this goal, Xerxes began preparations such as the ancient world had never seen. For 4 years, he gathered soldiers from all parts of his vast empire. Men from Mesopotamia, from Egypt, from Bactria, and even from distant regions as far as India were conscripted. The army that finally assembled was massive. The ancient historian Herodotus later claimed it consisted of millions of men. While modern historians consider this number to be greatly exaggerated, even more cautious estimates are impressive. Many assume that Xerxes fielded between 70,000 and 300,000 soldiers. But it wasn't just the land forces that were enormous. A huge fleet of over 1,200 warships accompanied the campaign. To make this massive invasion possible at all, Xerxes ordered some of the most ambitious engineering projects of antiquity. To bypass a dangerous coastline, he had a canal dug through a peninsula so that his fleet could pass safely. Even more spectacular was another construction. Xerxes ordered a bridge of ships to be built across the Hellespont Strait. This pontoon bridge spanned nearly a mile and connected Asia with Europe. In this way, his army could literally march across the sea. But when a storm destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes reacted with incredible rage. According to tradition, he had the sea itself whipped 300 times and the engineers responsible for the construction executed. This story clearly shows what kind of man Xerxes was. His power was absolute, his resources seemed limitless, and his will to subjugate Greece was stronger than anything else. As this huge force slowly set in motion and marched south, a wave of fear spread through the Greek city-states. Part 4. Greece faces the decision. As news of Xerxes' massive army spread across Greece, fear quickly spread among the Greek city-states. The size of the Persian force was intimidating, and many regions saw little chance of resisting such an opponent. Some of the northern city-states therefore decided to submit to the Persian king. For them, it seemed hopeless to fight against such a powerful army. The decision was simple: either bow to Persian rule or risk total destruction. The problem, however, was that Greece at that time was not a united country. It consisted of many independent city-states that were often rivals and regularly waged war against each other. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and many other cities had different interests, different political systems, and often little trust in one another. But now they faced a common threat that surpassed everything they had experienced before. If Greece was to survive, these rival cities had to truly work together for the first time. In this crisis, an alliance finally emerged that would later be known as the Hellenic League. It was a fragile alliance, born out of the necessity to stop the Persian invasion. For the leadership of the land forces, the choice fell on a city whose military reputation was feared and respected throughout Greece: Sparta. While other cities were occupied with philosophy, art, or trade, Sparta was known for something completely different. This society had oriented its entire life toward a single skill: war. And that is precisely why many Greeks believed that only Sparta possessed the discipline and the strength to at least hold off the Persian army. But to understand why Sparta was such an extraordinary military power, we must first take a look at the unique society that produced these legendary warriors. Part 5. The Extraordinary System of Sparta. To truly understand the Battle of Thermopylae, one must first understand Sparta. For Sparta was an extraordinary society in the Greek world, differing greatly from all other city-states. While cities like Athens occupied themselves with democracy, philosophy, art, and science, Sparta focused almost exclusively on one thing: war. The entire society was geared towards producing the best soldiers in the world. The foundation of this system was the so-called agoge, a state-organized training system that shaped every male Spartan from an early age. This strict selection began at birth. Elders of the city examined every newborn child. If an infant was considered weak or ill, they were left behind on a hillside. Only the strongest were to survive and become part of Spartan society. For those who survived this first test, a harsh training began at the age of 7. The boys were separated from their families and placed in state training programs that lasted more than a decade. They did learn to read and write, but the focus of their training was on discipline, endurance, and combat skills. The boys lived together in simple housing and were intentionally given too little food. This was meant to teach them to steal, a skill that could be useful in war. But if they were caught stealing, they were severely punished. Not because they had stolen, but because they had been clumsy enough to get caught. During their training, the young Spartans learned to endure pain without showing weakness. They were trained to follow orders without hesitation and to place the welfare of Sparta above their own lives. Their training focused on physical strength, the handling of weapons, and the complex movements of the phalanx formation, the primary battle formation of the Spartan army. Courage was considered the highest virtue in Sparta. Cowardice, on the other hand, was the greatest shame. A soldier who fled the battlefield was cast out by society and shunned by everyone. For many Spartans, the fear of this social ostracism was greater than the fear of death in battle. The women of Sparta also differed from those of other Greek cities. They received an education, practiced sports, and enjoyed significantly more freedom than women in many other regions of Greece. Their most important task, however, was to raise strong sons for Sparta. A famous Spartan saying describes this attitude particularly clearly. Mothers are said to have told their sons before battle, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." This meant they either returned as victors or died in battle. This system shaped generations of warriors, and it was from this very system that King Leonidas and his 300 bodyguards emerged. Men who had been prepared their whole lives to fight and die in battle. Part 6. The Greeks' Plan. As Xerxes' massive army moved slowly southward, the Greek city-states urgently had to decide how to face this threat. The balance of power was obvious. The Persians had an overwhelming superiority in soldiers and a huge fleet. An open battle on a plain would most likely have meant a quick defeat for the Greeks. In this difficult situation, a man emerged whose strategic thinking would become decisive: the Athenian general Themistocles. He recognized that the Greeks had to compensate for their small numbers by skillfully using the landscape. His plan was simple but extremely effective. The Greeks were to fight simultaneously at two narrow geographical points. On land, they were to stop the Persian army in a narrow mountain pass. At the same time, the Greek fleet was to block the Persian navy in a narrow strait. In this way, the Persian fleet could be prevented from supporting the land army or bypassing the Greek defenders. If the plan worked, the enormous numerical superiority of the Persians would be severely limited. The place the Greeks chose for the defense on land was a pass called Thermopylae. The name translates to the Hot Gates, named after the hot sulfur springs in the area. Geographically, this place was nearly ideal for a defense. In 480 BC, the pass consisted of an extremely narrow corridor between steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other. In some places, the path was only about 100 meters wide. In such a narrow space, the huge Persian army could hardly use its numerical superiority. Large troop units could not attack simultaneously, and the Greeks could force the enemy into a direct frontal assault. Exactly here was where the Persian invasion was to be stopped. The task of holding this pass eventually fell to one of the two kings of Sparta. His name was Leonidas. Part 7. Leonidas and his 300 elite warriors. The task of defending the pass of Thermopylae eventually fell to the Spartan king Leonidas. But at that very moment, a serious problem arose that made the defense of Greece more complicated. The Persian invasion fell exactly at the time of two of the Greeks' most important religious festivals. On one hand, the Olympic Games were taking place, one of the most sacred events in the entire Greek world. On the other hand, Sparta was celebrating its own religious festival, the Carneia. During the Carneia, it was strictly forbidden by Spartan law to lead military campaigns. For the Spartans, religious regulations were of the utmost importance, and even a looming invasion could not simply override this tradition. Thus, the Spartan elders faced a difficult dilemma. On one hand, they had to respect their law. On the other hand, all of Greece faced an existential threat. Finally, they found a compromise. The entire Spartan army could not march out, but King Leonidas was allowed to march north immediately. He was accompanied by his personal bodyguard of 300 warriors. These men were not just ordinary soldiers. They were experienced veterans who had been carefully selected. Herodotus even reports a remarkable detail. Leonidas deliberately chose only men who already had sons. In this way, he ensured that their family lines could continue. This decision suggests that Leonidas already suspected that this mission might be a journey of no return. Before he set off, Leonidas sought another important source of advice. He had the famous Oracle of Delphi consulted, the most important religious authority in the Greek world. The oracle's answer was both mysterious and terrifying. Either Sparta itself would be destroyed by the Persians, or a king from the lineage of Heracles must die. For a Spartan king like Leonidas, who had lived his entire life according to the ideals of duty, honor, and sacrifice, the meaning of this prophecy was clear. The choice was, in truth, no choice. Leonidas marched north to meet his fate. Part 8. Preparing for battle. While King Leonidas marched north, other Greek allies joined him along the way. When the forces finally reached the pass of Thermopylae, the Greek army consisted of about 7,000 men. It was a mixed army from various city-states, including Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and soldiers from several other regions of Greece. Compared to the massive Persian army, this force was tiny, but in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Greeks hoped that their discipline, their equipment, and the favorable landscape would make the difference. As soon as they reached the pass, the Greeks immediately began preparing for the defense. They restored an old defensive wall known as the Phocian Wall. This wall blocked the narrowest section of the pass and formed an ideal position to stop the enemy. Behind this wall, the Greeks positioned their most important combat unit, the hoplites. The hoplites were heavily armed infantry soldiers and formed the backbone of the Greek armies. One could say they were the tanks of the ancient world. A hoplite wore bronze breastplate armor, bronze greaves, and a characteristic Corinthian helmet that covered almost the entire head. His primary weapon was a long spear called a dory. For close combat, he also carried a short sword, the Xephos. But the most important piece of equipment for a hoplite was his large round shield, the hoplon. This shield was made of wood reinforced with bronze and protected the soldier's body from the neck to the knees. The hoplites fought in a formation known as the phalanx. In this formation, the soldiers stood close, shoulder to shoulder, and overlapped their shields so that a nearly impenetrable wall of bronze was created. The first rows pointed their long spears forward, creating a dangerous forest of spearheads. A well-disciplined phalanx unit was extremely difficult to break through, especially in narrow terrain. It was on this formation that Leonidas placed his hope to stop the massive Persian army in the narrow pass of the Hot Gates. Part 9. The first Persian attacks. Soon the massive Persian army arrived at Thermopylae. For the Greeks, the sight must have been overwhelming. Before them stretched a seemingly endless sea of soldiers, horses, and banners spreading across the landscape as far as the eye could see. King Xerxes had his camp set up and placed his throne on a hill from which he could overlook the battlefield. From there, he wanted to watch as his huge army crushed the small Greek force. But at first, something unexpected happened. For 4 days, Xerxes did not launch an attack. He simply waited. Obviously, he could hardly believe that this small group of warriors actually had the courage to oppose his army. Finally, he sent a messenger to the Greeks with a clear demand. They should lay down their weapons and surrender. The response from Leonidas later became one of the most famous sayings in history. Briefly and succinctly, it was, "Molon labe," come and take them. The Greeks showed no fear. While they waited for the attack, they calmly performed physical exercises, oiled their bodies, and combed their long hair. For the Spartans, this was a traditional ritual before a battle, especially before one they knew might cost them their lives. Finally, Xerxes lost his patience. On the 5th day, he ordered the attack. The battle began with a massive hail of arrows. The Persian archers fired so many arrows that the historian Herodotus later wrote that the sky was darkened by them. When a Spartan soldier heard this warning, he is said to have calmly replied, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." The Greek hoplites simply raised their large shields and formed a protective bronze shell. Most arrows bounced harmlessly off them. Frustrated, Xerxes finally sent his first wave of attack. About 10,000 Persian infantrymen, mainly Medes and Scythians. Their order was clear. They were to overwhelm the Greeks and bring them alive to Xerxes. But when these soldiers crashed against the Spartan shield wall, it quickly became clear that this attack would not go as Xerxes had expected. Part 10. The Immortals' Attack. The first attack of the Persian infantry ended in a disaster. Wave after wave of soldiers crashed against the Greek shield wall, but the Spartans and their allies held firm. The Persian warriors were numerous, but their equipment was significantly inferior to that of the heavily armored hoplites. Many Persian soldiers wore lighter armor and smaller shields made of woven material. Their spears were shorter and could hardly reach the Greek ranks. In contrast, the Greeks stood densely in their phalanx, protected by their heavy bronze shields and armed with long spears that they could thrust forward from a safe distance. For the attacking Persians, it was as if they were fighting against an impenetrable wall. Again and again, they were driven back. Men in the front rows fell and were trampled by the soldiers behind them. Soon the narrow pass was covered with the bodies of the fallen. Meanwhile, the Greeks fought in rotating groups. Some rows briefly withdrew to rest, while fresh soldiers stepped forward. This allowed them to maintain their strength over a long period. From his throne, Xerxes watched the battle with growing rage. Thousands of his soldiers had already fallen, and yet the Greek line had not moved a single step back. At the end of the first day, Xerxes had to realize that his regular troops could not break through the defense. Frustrated, he decided to deploy his most elite warriors. He called upon a unit that was feared throughout the Persian Empire, the so-called Immortals. This force consisted of 10,000 selected soldiers who served as the personal elite of the Persian king. Their name came from a special tradition. Whenever a soldier fell or became ill, he was immediately replaced. This ensured that the strength of the unit always remained constant, giving the impression that it was immortal. As these elite warriors marched into the narrow pass, Xerxes was convinced that they would succeed where his other troops had failed. But once again, he was to be mistaken. Part 11. The Treachery of Ephialtes. Even the Immortals could not break through the Greek defense. Although they were better equipped and more disciplined than most other Persian soldiers, they repeatedly encountered the same insurmountable wall of bronze and spears. The Greeks even began to use a new tactic. Sometimes they feigned a retreat. The Persian soldiers then believed the Greeks were fleeing and rushed after them in a disorganized manner. But suddenly, the Greek ranks turned around, quickly reformed into a phalanx, and attacked again. The surprised Persians were often completely caught off guard and hit hard. The historian Herodotus reports that during these battles, Xerxes is said to have jumped up from his throne in anger several times when he saw even his best troops being beaten back. At the end of the second day, thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead in the narrow pass of Thermopylae. The Greek defense line, however, was still unbroken. About 7,000 Greeks had held off an army for 2 days that was many times superior to them. It almost seemed as if the Greeks' position might indeed be impregnable. But while the Greeks rested during the night, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man whose name would later become a synonym for betrayal. His name was Ephialtes. Ephialtes was a local from the region and knew the mountains around Thermopylae very well. In the hope of a rich reward, he went to Xerxes' camp and revealed a crucial secret to him. There was a hidden mountain path that led around the pass. This path, known as the Anopeia path, ran through the mountains and led directly behind the position of the Greeks. Tatsächlich war Leonidas dieser Pfad nicht unbekannt. Ihn zu sichern, hatte 1000 phokische Soldaten auf dem Berg stationiert, die den Weg bewachen sollten. When Xerxes learned of this path, he immediately recognized his chance. That same night, he sent part of his army, including the Immortals, under the command of his general Hydarnes on this secret path. Under the leadership of Ephialtes, the Persian troops began their march through the dark mountains. While they moved silently through the night, the Greeks in the pass did not yet suspect that the fate of the battle had already been decided. Part 12. The Final Decision. As the Persian troops marched over the secret mountain path in the night, the decisive moment for the Greeks approached. As morning dawned, the Persians finally encountered the Phocian soldiers who were supposed to guard the path. The historian Herodotus reports that the Phocians were first alerted by the rustling of leaves in the forest. When they noticed the advancing Persians, the latter immediately attacked with a hail of arrows. The Phocian guards initially believed they were the actual target of the attack. Therefore, they withdrew further up the mountain to take up a defensive position there. But that was exactly their fatal error. The Persians had no interest at all in fighting them. Their actual goal was the pass of Thermopylae. Without losing time, they continued down the path to fall upon the Greeks' rear. A messenger from the Phocians immediately rushed to King Leonidas and brought him the shattering news. The Persian army would soon attack from both the front and the rear. This made it clear the position at Thermopylae was no longer tenable. The battle was basically lost. Leonidas then called the Greek commanders together to decide on the next course of action. Most of them were of the opinion that an immediate retreat was necessary. Only in this way could a part of the Greek army be saved to continue the fight later. Leonidas finally agreed. He dismissed the majority of the Greek forces and ordered them to leave the pass and retreat. This was not a surrender. The defense of Thermopylae had been intended from the beginning as a delay. For 2 days, the Greeks had held off the Persian army and inflicted heavy losses on it. They had already gained valuable time for Greece, but Leonidas himself had no intention of retreating. Part 13, the last fight for a Spartan king. A retreat under such circumstances was unthinkable. Leonidas was bound not only by his duty as a ruler, but also by the prophecy of the oracle that had predicted his death. For him, it was clear that he and his men would stay. The 300 Spartans prepared to defend the pass until the last moment, but they were not completely alone. In a remarkable decision, the 700 soldiers from the city of Thespeae, under the leadership of their commander Demophilus, also chose voluntarily to stay and fight alongside the Spartans. Their decision to stay and accept certain death later became one of the greatest examples of courage and loyalty in Greek history. In contrast, the 400 soldiers from Thebes acted differently. Many of them are said to have surrendered to the Persians during the final phase of the battle instead of fighting to the end. Besides these warriors, there were likely also some Spartan helots, servants, or auxiliary personnel who accompanied the Spartans. Thus, the final defensive group consisted of about 1,500 men. 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, as well as some helots now faced the entire Persian army. Leonidas knew that death was inevitable. According to tradition, he is said to have told his men to eat a hearty breakfast, for in the evening they would dine in the realm of the dead. When the final attack began, the Greeks no longer waited behind the wall. Instead, they advanced into the wider part of the pass, determined to take as many enemies as possible with them. What followed was a desperate and bitter struggle. The Greeks fought with a determination that impressed even their enemies. Herodotus reports that the Greeks continued to fight even when their spears broke. Then they reached for their swords, and when those too were destroyed, they fought with their bare hands and everything available to them. In the middle of the fight, King Leonidas finally fell. Immediately, a fierce fight broke out over his body as his warriors tried to protect him from the Persians. But eventually, the small group was surrounded from all sides. The numerical superiority of the Persian army was too great. The last defenders retreated to a small hill and fought there until the end. In the end, they were cut down by a hail of Persian arrows. Almost all the Spartans and Thespians died that day. The pass of Thermopylae had fallen. Part 14, the aftermath of the battle. At first glance, the Battle of Thermopylae was a clear victory for the Persian Empire. The pass had fallen, and the way to southern Greece now lay open. Xerxes had his army march further south, and soon after, the Persians reached the city of Athens. Most residents had already left the city, but Xerxes nevertheless had Athens burned to the ground. Temples were destroyed, houses went up in flames, and the city finally lay in ruins. In a final act of rage, Xerxes also had Leonidas's body desecrated. The Spartan king was decapitated, and his body was publicly displayed. Even by the standards of the time, this behavior was considered particularly cruel. But despite this apparent victory, the resistance at Thermopylae had a decisive effect. The 3 days during which Leonidas and his allies had held the pass bought the Greeks valuable time. While the Persians were delayed, the Greek forces could reorganize and prepare their defensive strategy. Only a few weeks later, a decisive battle took place at sea, the Battle of Salamis. There, the Greek fleet under the leadership of the Athenian strategist Themistocles lured the significantly larger Persian fleet into a narrow strait. Just as at Thermopylae, the Persians could not exploit their numerical superiority. The result was a crushing defeat for the Persian navy. A year later, the Battle of Plataea finally took place. There, a united Greek army succeeded in finally defeating the remaining Persian land forces. With this victory, the Persian invasion of Greece ended. Part 15: The Legacy of the 300 Spartans. Although the Battle of Thermopylae was a military defeat, it very quickly became one of the most famous stories in history. The resistance of Leonidas and his warriors had an impact that went far beyond the actual battlefield. For the Greeks, their sacrifice became a powerful symbol. It boosted the morale of the population and created a sense of unity between the previously often divided city-states. The story of the few warriors who stood against a giant army spread quickly throughout Greece and inspired many people to continue fighting against the Persian invasion. After the war, the Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae to honor King Leonidas and his men. A famous inscription attributed to the poet Simonides was also placed there. It roughly reads, "Wanderer, if you come to Sparta, report there that you have seen us lying here, as the law commanded." These words serve as a reminder that the Spartans did not fight out of courage alone, but also out of a sense of duty toward their laws and their homeland. For more than 2,500 years, the story of the 300 Spartans has been told again and again. Poets, historians, artists, and filmmakers have taken it up and reinterpreted it. The famous story inspired books, poems, and also modern films. Although many of these depictions take artistic liberties, the core of the story remains the same. The Battle of Thermopylae stands to this day as a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds, of sacrifice in the name of a greater cause, and of the unyielding will not to bow to tyranny. It reminds us that history is not only written by the victors. Sometimes it is also shaped by those who refuse to give up, even when they know they will lose. The defense of the Hot Gates was not the end of Greek history. It was the spark that ignited the resistance and ultimately helped preserve a culture that helped shape the foundations of Western civilization.